What if I told you that one of the most talked about actors in Hollywood right now almost didn't make it past his first few auditions? What if the guy who's currently dominating every awards conversation, every magazine cover, and every trending topic almost walked away from the whole thing entirely? Today we're going behind the curtain on Timothée Chalamet, and I promise you by the end of this video you're going to see him completely differently. We're talking about the stuff that doesn't make it into the polished press junket interviews, the real behind-the-scenes moments, the struggles, the unexpected decisions, the relationships with directors and co-stars that shaped who he is. Because there's a version of this story that most people only get in fragments, and today we're putting all of it together. Stay with me, because we're going to cover everything from his childhood between two countries, to the moment a certain director changed the entire trajectory of his life, to the drama and pressure that came with becoming one of the most scrutinized young men in the entertainment industry. Let's go. So first, let's talk about where this whole thing actually starts, because the origin story is more complicated than people realize. Timothée Chalamet was born in New York City on December 27, 1995. His father, Marc Chalamet, is French, and his mother, Nicole Flender, is American. This detail matters way more than it might seem, because growing up, Timothée was literally shuttled between two worlds. He spent significant time in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in France, where his paternal grandparents lived, and he was immersed in French culture, the French language, and a completely different way of experiencing life and art. His family was already embedded in the entertainment world in various ways. His maternal grandfather Harold Flender was a writer, his mother had been on Broadway, his uncle Rodman Flender is a director. So in a sense the creative world wasn't something Timothée stumbled into. It was the water he swam in from the very beginning. But here's what's interesting. Having that kind of background doesn't automatically translate into talent or success. Plenty of people come from creative families and never find their footing. What happened with Timothée was something different. He started attending the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts in New York, which if you know anything about the performing arts world in America, you know this is one of the most competitive and prestigious high schools you can get into. The environment there pushed him in ways that a traditional school never would have. He was surrounded by genuinely talented peers, people who were hungry and serious about their craft from a very young age. That competitive atmosphere, that immersion in technique and performance while most teenagers were focused on entirely different things, this is where the foundation was laid. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, and this is something that tends to get glossed over in the highlight reel version of his career. Before the roles that made him famous, before Call Me By Your Name, before Lady Bird, before all of it, there was a period of smaller work and uncertainty. He appeared in television, including a recurring role on Homeland, which gave him some exposure but wasn't exactly the launchpad to stardom. He had minor film appearances. He was grinding in the way that almost every working actor grinds, taking what comes, learning on the job, building something slowly. And during this period, the question that always hangs over young actors was hanging over him too. Is this actually going to happen? Because the industry is brutal in this specific way. It doesn't announce when something is about to change. You don't get a warning that a life-altering opportunity is coming. You just keep showing up and hoping. Then came the call that changed everything. Luca Guadagnino, the Italian director with an extraordinary eye for intimacy and emotional texture, was putting together Call Me By Your Name. The film was based on André Achiman's novel, and it required something genuinely rare for the lead role. It needed a young actor who could carry enormous emotional weight without seeming like he was performing. It needed someone who could be present on screen in a way that felt almost uncomfortably real. The audition process for this film was intense, and there are accounts suggesting that Guadagnino saw something in Timothée that he felt had to be preserved and cultivated rather than just directed in a conventional way. The collaboration between them on set in northern Italy was described by those involved as genuinely unique. Guadagnino gave his cast a level of freedom that not all directors offer, and Timothée apparently responded to that freedom by going places emotionally that surprised even the people around him. The famous peach scene, the final fireplace scene where he cries silently as the credits roll, these weren't moments that came from nowhere. They came from weeks of preparation, from a director who trusted his actor, and from an actor who was willing to be completely exposed and vulnerable in front of a camera. That final scene in particular is one of those moments in cinema that people talk about for years because it doesn't feel like acting. It feels like watching something real happen to a real person. And the behind-the-scenes truth of that scene is that it required Timothée to access something very deep and hold it for an extended period, while a camera simply watched him. The result of that film was seismic. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor at just 22 years old, making him the third youngest nominee in that category in Oscar history. The cultural impact was immediate and enormous. He went from being a working actor with a solid but unspectacular resume to being the most talked-about young talent in Hollywood practically overnight. But here's where the behind-the-scenes story gets layered in a way that's really worth paying attention to. Because fame at that level, arriving that fast, is not just a reward. It's also a test. And the way Timothée handled what came next tells you a lot about who he actually is when the cameras aren't rolling. There was a period after Call Me By Your Name where the opportunities coming his way were overwhelming in both quantity and scale. He could have chased the biggest franchise, the highest paycheck, the most commercially obvious path forward. Instead, the choices he made were consistently interesting and often deliberately challenging. He did Lady Bird with Greta Gerwig, where he played a supporting role that was emotionally complex despite limited screen time. He did Beautiful Boy, where he played a teenager struggling with methamphetamine addiction opposite Steve Carell, and the preparation for that role was grueling. He researched addiction extensively and worked with people who had lived through those experiences to make sure the portrayal was honest rather than just dramatic. Then came the collaboration with Greta Gerwig again on Little Women, where he played Laurie, a role that required him to navigate being the charming, lovable character who also experiences rejection and growth in a way that didn't tip into either villainy or self-pity. And around this time, behind the scenes, something was quietly becoming clear to those watching closely. This was not a flash in the pan. This was someone building a body of work with intentionality. Now let's talk about something that people are genuinely curious about but doesn't always get addressed directly. The personal side. Because Timothée Chalamet has been remarkably guarded about his private life compared to many celebrities of his level of fame. He's spoken in interviews about the difficulty of navigating fame when you're young, about the ways in which public scrutiny can be genuinely disorienting when you're still figuring out who you are as a person. There have been relationships that became tabloid fodder, and his approach to those situations has generally been to neither confirm nor deny, to deflect with humor when cornered, and to redirect attention back to the work. Whether you see that as strategic, or simply as a reasonable defense of personal space, it's consistent. He made a choice fairly early on to not perform his personal life for the audience, even as his professional life became more and more public. And this is interesting from a psychological standpoint, because it creates a specific kind of fascination. When someone is simultaneously incredibly visible and incredibly private, the public tends to become more curious, not less. Everything he does is analyzed and dissected. Every appearance, every outfit, every casual social media moment, the scrutiny is extraordinary, and the fact that he has largely maintained his boundaries despite it says something. There's also the question of his relationship with French culture and identity, which comes up regularly in conversations about who he is. He speaks French fluently, he has a deep connection to France, and he represents in many ways a genuinely bicultural sensibility that is relatively rare in American film stars. He's not performing European sophistication, it's actually part of how he was raised and how he sees the world, and this has influenced the kinds of projects he's drawn to, the kinds of directors he seeks out, the aesthetic sensibilities that show up in his choices. Now let's shift to something that became a genuinely defining chapter in his career, and one of the most interesting behind-the-scenes stories in recent Hollywood history. Denis Villeneuve's Dune. When it was announced that Timothée Chalamet would play Paul Atreides, the protagonist of Frank Herbert's epic science fiction saga, reactions were mixed in that very internet way, where some people were immediately enthusiastic and others were immediately skeptical. Paul Atreides is not a small role. It's not a supporting character with interesting quirks. It's the emotional and narrative center of one of the most beloved and complex science fiction properties ever written, and it requires an actor who can portray a young man transforming under almost incomprehensible pressure. The production of Dune was massive and logistically intense in ways that most film projects simply are not. Shooting took place in Jordan, in Budapest, in Abu Dhabi. The physical demands on the cast were real. The preparation that Timothée did for that role included extensive physical training, work with dialect coaches to nail the specific vocal quality that Villeneuve wanted for the character, and deep engagement with the source material to understand not just what Paul does in the story, but why he does it, and what it costs him. What's fascinating about the Dune collaboration is how Villeneuve spoke about his leading man. There's a quality in Timothée, according to those involved in the production, that registers differently on camera than it does in person. A kind of interior intensity that the camera picks up and amplifies. Villeneuve was very deliberate in how he used this quality, often filming Timothée in ways that emphasized stillness and observation, allowing the viewer to project onto him before the character has even spoken. The sequel, Dune Part 2, pushed everything further. The story demands that Paul become something far darker and more ambiguous, and this required Timothée to do something that's genuinely difficult for actors who've built their appeal on a certain kind of warmth and vulnerability. He had to make the audience simultaneously follow and fear his character. He had to make Paul's choices understandable even as they become increasingly troubling. The behind-the-scenes accounts of working on that film suggest that the emotional and physical toll was significant. He's spoken about the weight of carrying a franchise of that scale and what it does to your relationship with the work when millions of people are watching and waiting. And then there's the Bob Dylan project. Oh boy. A Complete Unknown is the film that arrived and absolutely silenced any remaining doubters about what Timothée Chalamet is capable of. Here's the behind-the-scenes reality of what that film required. He didn't just play Bob Dylan. He learned to play Bob Dylan's music himself, on guitar, on harmonica, with the specific vocal style and performance approach that Dylan had in the early years of his career. This wasn't CGI. This wasn't a stunt double for the music sequences. This was months and months of dedicated work with musicians and vocal coaches to develop genuine proficiency. The decision to do the musical performances himself, rather than rely on technical shortcuts, was deliberate and bold. It would have been completely understandable to use existing recordings or to film around the music in a way that obscured the fact that it wasn't him playing. Almost any other actor in the same position would have taken that easier path. He didn't. And the resulting performances in the film have a quality of authenticity that simply could not have been achieved any other way. There's something worth pausing on here because it speaks to a pattern that runs through everything he's done. Timothée Chalamet does not take the easy version of the job. When he takes on a role, he seems to have a genuine compulsion toward doing it as fully and honestly as possible, even when a less demanding approach would probably have gotten him the same result commercially. This is not a quality you can fake over the course of 10 years. It shows up too consistently. Think about it. The emotional rawness of Call Me By Your Name, the physical and psychological research for Beautiful Boy, the careful work on Little Women's more demanding emotional beats, the physical transformation and mythological weight of Dune, and now the musical mastery required for A Complete Unknown. Each of these represents a significant personal investment that went beyond what the job description required. Now let's talk about the industry context that surrounds all of this, because it matters for understanding what's actually impressive about his trajectory. Hollywood is not kind to young actors who get too famous too fast. There is a very specific and well-documented phenomenon where an actor or actress gets declared the next big thing, gets elevated to a level of hype that no human being could realistically sustain, and then gets written off when reality inevitably fails to match the hyperbole. It happens constantly. It's almost a genre unto itself. The fact that Timothée Chalamet has navigated this without experiencing that kind of spectacular crash is genuinely unusual. And looking at the behind-the-scenes decisions, you can start to understand why. He has been extraordinarily selective. He has turned down projects that would have been commercially huge but artistically hollow. He has maintained relationships with directors who challenge and push him rather than simply deploying his existing charm. He has refused to become a brand in the way that many young stars get turned into brands, where the person disappears and what's left is a carefully managed persona. He has also been fortunate in his collaborators, the directors who've shaped his career: Guadagnino, Gerwig, Villeneuve, James Mangold on the Dylan film. These are not directors who make movies carelessly. Working with people at that level of craft consistently is partly luck and partly a reflection of the fact that serious directors want to work with serious actors. There's also something to be said about the cultural moment he arrived in. He emerged at a time when the conversation about masculinity in film and in culture broadly was shifting. He represented something that felt genuinely new, a young male star who was emotionally expressive, who engaged openly with art and culture, who didn't perform toughness or invulnerability. And this connected with an audience that was ready for that. Whether this was strategic or simply authentic is almost impossible to know from the outside, but the timing was undeniably powerful. Something else worth discussing, because it genuinely reveals character, is how he handles the scrutiny of being considered one of the most attractive people in the world by a significant portion of the population. This is a strange thing to have to navigate, and the way it gets handled speaks volumes. He's self-deprecating about it in interviews in a way that feels genuine rather than performed. He doesn't seem to be leveraging his appearance in cynical ways or building an identity around it. He talks about craft, about the work, about the directors and writers who've shaped him. He redirects in a way that suggests he finds the fixation on his looks more baffling than flattering. Now let's bring this all together and talk about where things stand right now and what the behind-the-scenes picture looks like going forward. As of early 2026, Timothée Chalamet is at a genuinely remarkable position in his career. He has the Oscar nomination history, the critical credibility, the franchise association with Dune, the proven musical ability from a complete unknown, and a track record of choosing projects that keep audiences and critics genuinely surprised and engaged. There are upcoming projects that people in the industry are paying close attention to. His continued collaboration with Luca Guadagnino is something that observers of his career watch with particular interest, because that relationship has produced some of his most extraordinary work, and there's clearly still more to be explored within it. And the broader question of where he takes his career from here, whether he leans into the franchise space further or pulls back toward more intimate and challenging material, is genuinely open. What the behind-the-scenes story of Timothée Chalamet ultimately reveals is something that's both simple and rare. He showed up with talent. Yes, but talent alone doesn't explain the trajectory. What explains it is the combination of genuine artistic seriousness, intelligent decision-making, the courage to be vulnerable in a world that often punishes vulnerability, and a consistent refusal to take shortcuts, even when shortcuts would have been profitable and safe. He grew up between two cultures and internalized something from both of them. He trained seriously before he had any reason to believe it would pay off. He found mentors and collaborators who saw what he was capable of and helped him develop it. He handled extraordinary early fame with more grace than most 22-year-olds could have managed. And he has continued to push himself into genuinely difficult territory, rather than coasting on what was already working. That's the behind-the-scenes story. Not a fairy tale about a kid who got lucky, not a cautionary tale about the pitfalls of fame, but something more interesting than either of those. A story about someone who took the gifts they were given, worked incredibly hard to develop them, made smart and sometimes brave choices at key moments, and ended up becoming something that the entertainment world doesn't produce very often. A genuinely great actor who is still, by any reasonable measure, just getting started. If you found this interesting and want to go deeper on more of these kinds of behind-the-scenes stories about the people who are actually shaping culture right now, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which performance of his you think is actually his best, because I have a feeling this community is going to have some strong and divided opinions on that one. I'll see you in the next video.